Okay, so just for a follow-up to my previous video, I'm just raising my voice for the volume issues on my channel. There have been very different reactions in Havana and in Miami, two cities just 90 miles apart, but with a very different response to the big news of the death of Fidel Castro. I just want to add a little bit more to what I said earlier, and it's regarding the responses. Now, what struck me is these sort of celebrations going on in Miami. It got me thinking about the celebrations that occurred after the death of Margaret Thatcher here in the UK back in 2013. Thatcher was also a controversial figure, but for her many faults, and I'm not a Thatcherite, I do believe that she made some serious errors, but for all her many faults, one thing that Thatcher did not do was torture her opponents. She didn't have political opponents arrested. Um, she did not have members of the Labour Party, Labour MPs in the 1980s put in jail. That's exactly what Fidel Castro done. That's his legacy. So all over the world there will be communists, especially in Western countries, I might add, who praise Castro, and they praise him because they have this sort of vision of his socialist utopia. So they point, for example, to world class healthcare and this sort of thing. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't think that covers his many crimes and his severe human rights abuses, the severe human rights abuses that went on in Cuba. Now, some of the people who are praising him are not surprising. Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping. In the case of Xi Jinping and Putin, it's more because their countries were closely connected with Cuba. Interesting that Donald Trump and Barack Obama had very different responses. Obama made a measured response. He said, "We extend a hand of friendship to the Cuban people." He was very careful not to praise Castro, nor did he vilify Castro. Um, Francois Hollande in France made a similar, somewhat balanced statement. Trump was very blunt. And I have to say, I'm not going to criticize Trump for that because everything he said was factual. The only thing about Donald Trump saying it is it's a little bit hypocritical because during the campaign, Trump said he would endorse the use of torture himself to apprehend terror suspects. So, it's great that Donald Trump suddenly found a conscience on human rights. I hope that's consistent with his presidency. But there was things Trump said during his campaign that certainly raised eyebrows. But let's not make no mistake about it. When the Cuban Revolution occurred in 1959, Castro promised free and democratic elections. It never happened. He ended up, unless I'm mistaken, as the world's longest serving non-royal head of state. He was a dictator in every sense of the word. And all I would say to those communists who are mourning his passing today is they should remember, especially if they're in democratic countries, whilst they have the freedom to praise Castro, within Cuba and probably within other single party states, those who were critical of Castro and his ideology did not have that freedom. So that's what I find very irritating about, especially Western communists. Apparently, there was clashes in Madrid over this. Here in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, not particularly surprising, um, praised Castro. Now, you would expect a left wing leader to do that, but he didn't even try to get any sort of mention of the human rights situation. So I wouldn't even have a problem with Corbyn praising Castro if he at least balanced it out. From what I could see, he made a no attempt to do that. I've checked his Facebook page, no sort of balance. I understand world leaders have to be diplomatic. They can't just come out and say, "Oh, a dictator is dead." They have to be diplomatic. But the left is deluded. The hard left is deluded. Um, and this very much comes into the issue of regressive left. They talk about liberty, they talk about standing up to American imperialism, they talk about wicked capitalism. And for whatever faults those things have, and they do, what they ignore is that fundamentally communism is the very epitome of totalitarianism. Because if you have a system that's supposedly utopian, that has world class healthcare, that stands up to big bad America, but you aren't allowed to criticize that, what sort of role model system is that? You know, the sort of people who are praising Castro and his legacy. Um, in the case of developing countries, I'm somewhat more sympathetic because that ties into a Cold War situation whereby they saw Castro as a revolutionary figure. Western communists, I don't have much time for. Why? Because they live in democratic systems. They can see what democracy is, and they have a voice. They might not like the situation, they might not like their governments, but it is extremely rare that you have examples of democratic Western governments locking up socialists or communists. It just doesn't happen, even where communism is deeply controversial. Even in the United States in the 1950s, during the height of the Red Scare, yes, it's true that some people were unfairly accused of communism, but there's absolutely nothing comparable to the level of persecution that occurs in communist states. To put it bluntly, I despise communism. And when communist apologists say, oh, but it's not really communism, what they're basically doing is just trying to find excuses. Um, One thing about Castro, and I suppose this is some redemption for him, is that unlike other dictators, for example, unlike Robert Mugabe, Castro didn't particularly live a life of luxury. So in that sense, he wasn't a case of a tin pot tyrant, along the lines of Robert Mugabe. So I suppose that's one redeeming feature. Another thing I will say about Cuba, and I stand by everything I say about communism. But honestly, I don't want to see Cuba just become another. I don't want to see Cuba have McDonald's in every corner and become ultra modern and so on. I want to see it greatly improve the human rights situation. I want to see more Cubans have freedom of expression, and I want to see a transition to democracy peacefully. But there are certain aspects of Cuban culture I don't want to see go. I don't want to see those old vintage cars, etc. I don't want to see that be replicated for sort of. I guess the fear in Cuba was always this idea it would become the 51st state and end up looking like America. Well, I don't particularly want to see Havana look like Miami, but what I do want is Cubans to have more freedom. And you simply cannot argue that Castro gave people freedom in that sense, because anyone who stood up against him were locked up or tortured. So let's just not lose sight of that. Yes, Castro was a hugely important figure, and his eulogies will show that. But he was a dictator. By definition, he was a dictator. So that's it. And that's all there is to it. You know, communists can say what they want about however progressive his healthcare system was, but they cannot escape the fact that in Cuba, dissidents simply couldn't speak up. Nothing they say can do that, can escape from that fact. Now, I'm not surprised that Corbyn is praising Castro. I think Corbyn's a hypocrite, to be quite honest, because Corbyn has often spoken about human rights, and yet when it comes to ideologies he's comfortable with, such as Chavez, the Chavismo movement in Venezuela, or whether it be Fidel Castro, he's gushing with praise. So, the left are pretty selective about what they preach about. And that's it. I just see the contrast between Margaret Thatcher and Fidel Castro. Thatcher had many faults and she did cause a lot of suffering with her policies, but she did not torture dissidents. She did not have dissidents arrested for opposing her. There were times when she was borderline autocratic, but that did not happen. So that is an important thing to point out. Anyway, I'll leave it there. And any communists who want to come onto this video and say, oh, you don't understand communism. For this video, I'm going to leave the comment section open just to prove the difference between what I believe in and what you believe in. Because communist websites wouldn't allow dissenting points of view. That's the point.